A stream of hypervelocity darts stitched a pattern up the concrete wall and toward the spot where my head had been a second ago. If the elf machine gunner had been half a second quicker on the trigger, my head would now be a rapidly evaporating mist of pink. What most impressed me, though, was the aim. I'd fought combat veteran elves before, but something had changed. I could hear the excited hooting of other elves as they advanced in our position. They were using tactics, machine gunners laying out suppressive fire, while their squads advanced one by one. I'm up. They see me. I'm down. Every infantryman in the U.S. Army knows it by heart. And these elves did too. I'd never seen such a well-coordinated batch in over a year of war. From somewhere a quarter mile away, there was the sharp crack of a single rifle, and I instantly recognized it as Santos's. An elf machine gunner sitting atop one of their alien infantry fighting vehicles had half his skull blown away. I could tell from the way the gore splattered that the shot had come from somewhere at our 2 o'clock. Santos must have found a hell of a sniping spot, but she had put herself slightly ahead of our main defensive line. Another shot rang out, and another machine gunner had his head turned inside out. Then there were no more shots, and I knew she was moving to a new position, the sign of an expert sniper. I was grateful the elves hadn't yet learned how to implement snipers of their own. Our position was in the ruins of a row of townhomes facing the elevated metro rail a few hundred meters away. To our backs was the river, a dangerous place to be. But that was on purpose. We'd secured a strong position on the west side of the river and were giving the elves hell as they attempted a crossing from this area. We'd inevitably lose this position, but we had several fast boats ready to exfil us to the other side. The point was to make them bleed. With the enemy machine gun fire slackened off, it was our turn to repay the favor. Kershane popped up from behind cover a few meters away and opened up with a borrowed M240. The big machine gun spit out 7.62mm fire at a frightening rate. I'd seen what it did to humans during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but what it did to elves was different. They were skinnier than us, their torsos not as dense. The rounds blew straight through them and would send them spinning like ballerinas. I suspected they weren't doing much internal damage, especially since the elves didn't even wear body armor. But that didn't seem to matter. The bullets punched straight through before fragmenting on any dense bones, but left behind gaping holes that quickly led them to bleeding out. I popped up and let loose a 40mm grenade from my M203 grenade launcher, then popped down to reload. Didn't even bother to see the effect. That's the type of rookie mistake that gets you killed. I was up long enough, though, to see that 2 of the elf squads had finally made it to the parking lot of the former townhomes, a big communal parking space that ran about 75 meters wide and 200 long. There were still wrecks of vehicles from the people who had never fled the city, or perhaps simply abandoned them, and the elves made for the safety of those wrecks exactly the way we might have done. Those of us who hadn't served multiple tours fighting insurgents and terrorists, at least. As the elves ducked for cover seconds later, there was a rapid-fire series of explosions. Improvised explosive devices were planted in the wrecks and went off via a remote radio trigger, spraying shrapnel across the parking lot. At least a dozen elves were immediately cut down. Another 24 were scattered around, dazed and bleeding profusely from shrapnel wounds. We didn't even bother executing them, even though they were easy targets. Instead, we waited for their comrades to try to pull them to safety and shot the rescuers instead. There was a certain frightful irony in our use of the same terrorist tactics we'd fought 2 decades against, here on the outskirts of the nation's capital. Now we were the insurgents up against a vastly superior force, but we were having much better success. If Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and 36 other terror networks that had funneled fighters into Iraq and Afghanistan had written the asymmetrical playbook, we'd mastered it, taking the best of what they had offered and adding our own technological sophistication and over 200 years of professional soldiering. Once very near to here, the forefathers of the U.S. Army's Rangers had fought British troops in the swamplands, ambushing them and melting away into the night, severing supply lines and bleeding enemy formations until they were too weak to continue advancing. The swamp was gone, but that American rebel spirit lived on, with some modern touches. I could hear the hum of the drones before I saw them, and I was impressed at how quickly they arrived on scene. The small quadcopter FPV drones had been available by the thousands in shopping malls and stores all across war-torn Washington. But before the invasion had started, the Army had disseminated millions of them to anyone who wanted them, just like the Ukrainians had handed out rifles to anyone who wanted to fight the invading Russians. We'd given out drones, complete with guides on drone tactics, lifted straight from the lessons learned by our Ukrainian allies. These were militarized drones, though, complete with artificial intelligence on board. I only got a brief glimpse of the swarm as it flew overhead, flying low and hugging terrain to avoid elf radar, thus giving themselves away. It seemed to me there must have been about 3 dozen of the things, though, buzzing like a high-velocity swarm of very angry bees. Only a few of the drones were actually manned, maybe a third of them. The rest were synced up via radio to those pilot drones and had onboard artificial intelligence. All the human pilots had to do was use their drone to mark out what type of target to hit, and the AI drones got to the grisly business all on their own. The first group of drones was only a little bigger than my open hand, and those swooped down on the elves hiding behind cover, detonating on impact. The small internal explosive was surrounded by a copper alloy core that turned it and the drone itself into a spray of shrapnel on impact. A struck elf was almost certainly instantly killed, but his buddies nearby had a good chance of getting wounded. The onboard AI ignored the elves in the open. We could cut them down ourselves, prioritizing any elf behind solid cover. The second group shot straight up and then began to dive down at high speed. These were larger, maybe 1.5 feet across, and carried a shaped anti-vehicle warhead on their belly. Upon striking an elf tank or an IFV, the warhead turned into a molten jet of liquid metal that pierced through the thinner top armor of the vehicle. The crew inside would suddenly have the oxygen around them consumed by fire, raising the heat to nearly 1,000 degrees for a little less than a second, long enough to kill or seriously injure any occupants. We'd taken a gamble on those, but physics and, more importantly, economics worked the same here as on whatever planet the elves were from. Their armored vehicles had thinner top armor because, just like ours, they had to save on weight somewhere. The elf fire had slacked off significantly and then died down completely. I looked up from behind cover and I could see a few drones moving slowly at high altitude, a sure sign that the assault force was dead. They were looking for any reinforcements or perhaps stragglers somewhere. We left our cover and began to advance across the parking lot, inspecting the dead elf assault force. Moving from body to body, we checked for survivors. Any that we found, we finished off with our knives. No point in wasting bullets. We knew they could gain knowledge from breaking down our own soldiers in a process I didn't quite understand that involved feeding the ensuing genetic soup to new batches of lab-grown elves. Major Holbrook had begun to suspect that they could do the same with their own and ordered us to execute any survivors of an engagement if we could. Satisfied the grisly work was done, we headed back to the ruins. Another team would conceal the fast boats we would have used if we were under threat of being overrun, while we headed underground through a secret hatch built into one of the former townhomes. It was part of the old Cold War underground tunnel network that spanned across Washington, D.C., with entrances hidden away in government buildings and sometimes ordinary homes secretly owned by the government. It was once meant to ensure part of the government could survive a Soviet nuclear attack. Now it was the only reason the occupying elf forces hadn't completely overrun our resistance movement. Before taking my turn to duck underground, I looked back across the ruins to the elevated train track. Suddenly it hit me. I rode on those tracks once, when I was a kid visiting Washington, D.C. with my dad. We'd taken the train all the way from some town in Virginia, and I could picture the scene perfectly. I even remembered what this block of townhomes once looked like as the train passed them. Classic brownstones with D.C. sprawling out behind them. There was a hardline in one of the many command bunkers built into the secret D.C. underground shelter system. It linked up all the other command bunkers, and you could either ring one specific one or all of them on the network at once. It was old-school landline technology, impossible to hack, and tapping it would require drilling through several feet of concrete. We felt pretty safe that the elves had no clue it existed or had even thought to access it. They were showing increasing sophistication in their military and even intelligence capabilities as they fought their first war against a planet with post-industrial age professional militaries, but they were still a century or more behind in most areas. Whoever they'd conquered before us, they were either relatively primitive or hadn't put up much resistance. Despite being confident that the comm system was fully secure, we still kept to strict InfoSec procedures. No names, no locations, nothing of any intelligence value. I didn't even need a name to recognize Major Holbrook's voice on the other end. Call sign Iron 1. Ever since the barracks raid fiasco that had resulted in nearly 100 dead or wounded, the Major had taken command over the Washington resistance. Lieutenant Mason, the female Navy SEAL who'd been in charge and ordered the barracks raid over Holbrook's orders to attack the elf breeding sites where they created the new soldiers, hadn't even put up a fight. She'd been unusually quiet for weeks now. It had been a catastrophic mistake. The elves were fully prepared to defend their sensitive installations now. and the sewer trick would never work again. Now we were feeling the brunt of that mistake, with a new batch of more experienced, more elite elves being grown every 33 days and delivered straight to the front lines. Scouts say you've got elf forces moving in on your position, redirecting from up north. You did a hell of a job holding that strip of ground. About time for a little raid we pulled off to get our hands on some new goodies. I knew better than to ask questions I wanted to over the landline, but my eyebrow shot up. What kind of goodies had the Major gotten his hands on in the Washington ruins? The possibilities were endless. Sir, we got a few wounded, but no KIA yet. Drones saved our asses. We figured we could hold out another assault or two before getting wet across the river. Somewhere in what had been furnished to be the main command center of the underground Washington resistance, Major Holbrook shook his head slowly. Not with what's coming at you. Remote cameras and drone recon show they're moving dogs and behemoths on your position. You pissed them right the hell off. I couldn't help but gulp involuntarily. Dogs were the nickname we'd given to the genetically engineered monsters the elves had cooked up to supplement their losses. They were limited in replacing losses by the capacity of the breeding facilities they set up. We estimated each facility could pump out a few hundred soldiers a month, and there were 3 in Washington, so about just over 1,000. They were busy building a 4th, but it wouldn't be online for months yet. In the meantime, they'd taken to creating lab-grown monsters to let loose on us. We'd first encountered them in the Midwest on our original raid on a breeding facility. They'd rounded up humans and done God knows what to them, turning them into monsters covered in hard chitin armor that wasn't bulletproof but provided impressive protection. At the end of their arms, they'd grown out long blade-like appendages made of what I was assuming was their own bones. They were terrifying, disgusting, and completely mindless things. I'd rather face an entire elf mechanized force with nothing but a pistol than a group of dogs. But that wasn't the only horror the elves had cooked up. We had savaged their armored vehicle force, and those were expensive to transport halfway across the galaxy, so they were limited in number. They'd set up factories in occupied territories, but those too took time to fabricate. So in the meantime, they put their genetic engineering brilliance to work. I have no idea what the original subjects may have been, and we had our suspicions that it wasn't just one, but that they used multiple subjects in the creation of each. But the behemoths were basically their answer to biological armored vehicles. These monsters moved around like spiders and were the size of a house. They could take an entire platoon's worth of firepower and still smash through the front lines before collapsing, punching a hole in our defenses that elves on foot or dogs could exploit. The only sure way to bring them down quickly was artillery, air power, or anti-armor weapons, and all of those were in short supply. I licked my lips but kept my voice from shaking. How long do we have? They'll be there in 3-4 hours. Get some rest while you can. Thin their numbers, and get your ass across that river before they overwhelm you. Blow the tunnel entrance on your side of the river. I nodded, then remembered the Major couldn't see me. Yes, sir. I'm sending you some javelins. Don't have much left to spare. Put them to good use. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. The line was silent a moment. Don't die on me out there. The line went dead. A few hours to rest. I went to break the news to the squad and sought out Sergeant Jackson, one of the SOF guys who'd originally found us after our landing in the heart of DC. He was in command of 2nd Platoon, which was now technically made up of the 2nd Platoon and survivors of the 1st Platoon, which was basically the bulk of our under-force company. I'd have to let him know what was coming our way, and there would be preparations to make. On my way to Jackson, it finally dawned on me. If the Army was still keeping rank the way it had before the war, being in charge of this company technically means I must have gotten a battlefield promotion to captain. I made a note to have a word with payroll about that when we won the war. The shelter we commandeered must have been built to house a few hundred VIPs and their families. Now it housed barely 100 of us. The Resistance had a big recon section here, but they'd been the first to know what was coming and were well through packing up their gear. That let the cat out of the bag earlier than I would have liked. The company's morale had taken a few big hits in the last 2 weeks. The squad had turned one of the attached offices into its own personal HQ. I found Wood helping Gershane clean his newly adopted M240. Where's Santos? Wood nodded at one of the privacy curtains we'd set up to section out different sleeping sections for each of us. On cue, Santos stepped out from behind the curtain. She had a clean bandage on her left arm and she immediately picked up on my inquisitive glare. Nothing major, just a bad cut on some rebar while de-assing my position. About that, you were too far out front out there. She shrugged. It was a better position. It was exposed, and if we'd gotten pushed back to the river, I would have found my own way across. Santos set her hands on her hips, locking her eyes with mine. We'd all been stressed out lately, but this was borderline insubordination. This is my company now, and you're part of that company, a very important part. Santos went to speak, but I silenced her with a finger in the air. I trust your instincts, but you take too many chances sometimes. Stay closer next time. Santos's shoulders relaxed, and I was relieved. The last thing I needed right now was a power struggle. She nodded grimly and tossed me a quick yes, sir, which wasn't a great sign. Here in our little sanctuary, we'd largely made rank not matter. I shrugged it off, though. We got major incoming. Kershane didn't even look up from the components of his weapons as he cleaned. Could have guessed that from the way Recon's getting out of Dodge. Let me guess, we're getting wet? We will, but we'll have to fix them in place as long as we can. We got a good position to hold a bit. Wood nodded knowingly. It's a good position until it ain't, because the elves got it and we're trying to get across the river. Jackson's got demo guys rigging up the place. When we leave, nobody's holding it. Also, we're not dealing with elves tonight. That finally got everyone's attention. They're finally doing it, huh? Setting dogs loose on us. Kershane looked grim. He hadn't taken the discovery of the original test subjects well. Shot the only scientist we've ever gotten our hands on with his machine gun at point-blank range over it. Likely cost us a treasure trove of invaluable intelligence, but it was hard to blame him. That particular bunch had once been local kids. Yes, and worse. Holbrook says they're sending a behemoth. Wood let out a low whistle. Santos licked her lips nervously. Kershane seemed to be the only one unfazed. We got javelins, the major shipped across the river for us. 3 of them. Is 3 going to be enough? Kershane was back to nonchalantly cleaning his weapon. We'll have to make them enough, or get stomped to bits. He was already reassembling his M240. The bolt assembly shiny enough you'd think it was fresh from the factory. The gunfire was deafening in the underground corridors, but Holbrook was unfettered as he shouted orders to the runners hurrying to flee the compromised sanctum. The heart of the resistance had been located not far from the capital itself, right under the Air and Space Museum, and the elves had found a way in. The sound of the fighting was getting closer. Holbrook's gear was in the direction of the fighting. For now, his .45 sidearm would have to do. He had no idea how the hell the elves had found them after so long, but then again, they seemed to have taken a quantum leap in capabilities in the last few weeks, something he blamed directly on one person who had jeopardized an attempt to retake Washington and disobeyed a direct order. Satisfied that the techs had removed as much of the computer gear as possible and smashed what they couldn't take, he plucked an incendiary grenade off his belt loop and popped the pin. He kept the grenade on him at all times, always prepared for the worst-case scenario. Closing the door behind him, the grenade went off with a dull blast before consuming the room in flames. The defenders were fighting as instructed. Despite being the nerve center of the resistance, it was minimally staffed with only a single company for security. Lieutenant Mason had her flaws, but she commanded the resistance well. The entire effort was a largely decentralized front, the chain of command looser than normal, and each cell acting with great autonomy and being widely dispersed across the capital wasteland. The loss of this post was largely meaningless. There were 4 others ready to go as soon as Holbrook reached them, but taking this one would cost the elves dearly. The security teams fell back from prepared checkpoint to prepared checkpoint, letting the elves continuously push forward. By the 3rd line of defense, they'd begin to take separate exits out of the facility through designated bolt holes, sealed behind them by explosives. Each squad leader knew where to reconvene in approximately 48 hours' time, and if it was impossible, were under orders to link up with the other cells of the resistance and join their command. The elves were doing nothing but wasting bodies. The narrow choke points of the underground complex had been crafted into killing fields. The defenders lost 1 or 2 men to the hyper-velocity dart projectile weapons, but dished out far better than they got before suddenly disappearing into hidden bolt holes. Holbrook almost wished he could see the expression on the elf commander's face, he thought, as he hurried down his designated escape route. Lieutenant Mason joined him, barking out orders to a security team, putting up one final bit of resistance before making their own escape. Pistol in hand, Holbrook was cautious to any elf surprise, but the attackers seemed to have discovered only one way in. Rookie mistake. A filing cabinet stood in the way of a disguised escape tunnel, and Holbrook squeezed through it, followed by Mason. They waited a moment, but nobody else showed up. That concerned Holbrook. There should have been a squad of Marines to make the escape with them. They either got themselves killed or had been forced to use another evac point. The sound of elf hooting was drawing close enough now that the decision was made for him, and he nodded at Mason. Mason worked on the demolition charges set into the wall of the secret tunnel. It was just enough C4 to collapse the tunnel without causing a wider disaster. But Holbrook hurried down the tunnel anyway. He wanted to preserve what was left of his hearing. At the end of the tunnel, a ladder went up to a hidden service tunnel hatch that had once carried steam for heating through various downtown buildings. Climbing to the top, he waited for the dull roar of the C4 going off. And soon after, the lieutenant appeared at the bottom of the stairs, face slightly red from having obviously sprinted the distance. The pistol was still in his gun hand, and that hand twitched. Lieutenant Mason had jeopardized the entire military operation to retake the capital and rally the entire world's flagging morale in its war against the invaders. She'd done it because she'd been angry and vengeful. Nearly a year fighting behind the lines and losing lives every day, and she'd seen an opportunity to strike a major blow using the knowledge of the sewer connections the elves had linked their facilities to. That operation had been a disastrous failure, had cost them the element of surprise. The 3 operational facilities had been pumping out soldiers for 2 months now, and seemingly incorporated some quantum leaps in their designs, judging by the vastly improved performance. With the breeding facilities operational, the Army wouldn't risk a prolonged fight in the capital with a steady flow of enemy reinforcements. They would already have the advantage of very defensible terrain. Lieutenant Mason had proven an adept commander in the time that she'd been left to fend for herself, cut off behind enemy lines, and after her disastrous error, she'd been quick to fall in line as a very competent second. But she had disobeyed a direct order in wartime, an offense that, per the Uniform Code of Military Justice, carried the penalty of death. The lieutenant looked up at Holbrook from the bottom of the ladder, where she saw him looking down toward her with his .45 still in hand. Now check out I Survived 100 Days of the Invasion, not Minecraft, or watch this video instead.